There's something special about waking up each morning to the sight of your own land stretching out before you. That feeling of freedom, of having your own little piece of the world where you make the rules. At least, that's what I thought until the letter arrived. My name is Michael Collins. I bought this property 12 years ago, 5 acres just outside of Ridgeview Estates. I built this fence myself the first year. Nothing fancy, just sturdy cedar posts and planks to keep my animals in and mark my property line. Never had a single complaint from anyone. It was a Tuesday when everything changed. I grabbed the mail like I always do, bills, junk mail, and then this official-looking envelope. When I opened it, I couldn't believe what I was reading. Dear property owner, this letter serves as official notice that your property is in violation of Ridgeview Estates' HOA covenant regarding approved fencing structures. You are hereby required to remove the non-compliant structure within 30 days and submit plans for an approved replacement. Failure to comply will result in fines of $100 per day. Wait, what? I've had this fence for over a decade. And since when was I part of an HOA? I specifically bought this property because it was outside their jurisdiction. I immediately started digging through my documents. Turns out, 3 years ago, Ridgeview Estates expanded. They annexed several surrounding properties, including a sliver of land that bordered mine. According to their interpretation, that made me subject to their rules. Somehow, I missed the notification, probably because it was sent to my old address. I called the number on the letterhead, hoping there was some mistake. The woman who answered had the warmth of a glacier. "Mr. Collins," she replied in that condescending tone that made me want to throw my phone, "the rules are very clear. All residents must comply with HOA standards regardless of when their structures were built." But I never received any notice about this. That's unfortunate, but it's the homeowner's responsibility to stay informed of HOA regulations. $5,000. That's what they estimated it would cost to tear down my perfectly good fence and replace it with their approved model. All because some committee didn't like the look of cedar instead of their approved composite material. I needed to understand exactly what I was dealing with, so I drove over to the Ridgeview Estates office. Inside, I met Patricia Blackwood, who had the kind of smile that felt like a warning. "According to the new boundary maps, 0.28 acres of your property falls within our jurisdiction," she explained. "And since your fence crosses into that portion, the entire structure must comply." "You're telling me, because a tiny slice of my land now falls within your boundaries, I have to replace my entire fence?" "That's correct. HOA rules are quite clear on this point." As we talked, the door opened and a man stuck his head in. "Sorry to interrupt, Patricia, but we need you for the landscaping vote." "I'll be right there, Richard," she replied. "Mr. Collins, this is Richard Harmon, our HOA president." Richard gave me a quick once-over. "Ah, another fence issue? The ranch property? We've been trying to get that eyesore fixed for months now. It's visible from the Sullivans' back deck and completely ruins their mountain view." And there it was, the real reason behind my violation notice. "The Sullivans?" I asked. "Victor Sullivan is one of our board members. They built their dream home last year, and your rustic fence is the only thing marring their otherwise perfect view." So this wasn't about rules or property values. This was about one wealthy board member who didn't like looking at my fence from his deck. "What happens if I don't comply?" I asked. Richard's friendly demeanor slipped. "The fines begin at $100 per day and increase after 30 days. After 90 days, we place a lien on the property and can begin foreclosure proceedings." "You'd take someone's home over a fence?" "Rules are rules, Mr. Collins. We've done it before." On the drive home, I passed the Sullivan property, a massive modern monstrosity perched on the ridge overlooking my land. From their deck, they probably had a perfect view of my modest ranch house and the supposedly offensive cedar fence. I noticed my neighbor, Frank, walking his dog along our shared property line. "Hey, Frank, you get any letters from the HOA recently?" Frank snorted. "Those vultures? Not yet. What'd they get you for?" "My fence. Apparently it's an eyesore that's bringing down property values." "Your fence? Hell, that's one of the best-built fences in the county. You're not going to cave, are you?" "I'm working on a plan," I said. "You still have that surveyor friend?" Frank's eyes twinkled. Tim? Sure do. He'd love to stick it to those HOA types. The weekend after, a black SUV with the Ridgeview Estates logo pulled up my driveway. Richard Harmon and another man in a suit stepped out, both carrying clipboards. "This is Victor Sullivan, one of our board members," Richard said. "We thought we'd conduct an official inspection of the fence violation." Sullivan looked toward my fence with distaste. "The height exceeds our maximum by 2 inches. The posts are non-standard dimensions. And this weathered cedar, it's completely inconsistent with community aesthetics." "My property isn't part of your community," I reminded him. Sullivan turned to me, dropping all pretense of politeness. 0.28 acres of it is. That's all we need. The entire fence must be brought into compliance." "Or what?" I asked. "Or we'll make an example of you," he said coldly. "The board has allocated funds for legal action. We're prepared to go all the way to foreclosure if necessary." "The deadline stands, Mr. Collins. 30 days from the notice date, with full fines applying," Richard added. As they drove away, I noticed Sullivan looking back at my property, his eyes focused on the ridge where his house sat. This wasn't about rules. This was about a wealthy man who wanted to erase me from his view. That afternoon, Frank's surveyor friend Tim came by. After a few hours of work, he showed me his findings. "Their new boundary does include this small portion of your property," he explained, pointing to a thin sliver of land. "But here's what they didn't tell you. The boundary only touches your fence in exactly 2 places. The rest of your fence is completely outside their jurisdiction." "So they can't force me to replace the whole fence?" I asked hopefully. Tim grimaced. "Unfortunately, their bylaws are clear that any continuous structure that crosses their boundary must comply throughout. But," his eyes twinkled, "there's nothing that says it has to be a single continuous structure." "What do you mean?" "What if your fence wasn't just one structure? What if it was multiple, interlocking structures, each with its own design and purpose?" I spent the rest of the day studying the HOA guidelines. The approved fence designs were specific about materials and height, but vague about configuration. That night, I kept thinking about Sullivan's threat. I got up around 2 a.m. and found myself staring at an old puzzle book my nephew had left behind. It was open to a complex maze. That's when it clicked. The HOA wanted me to build a compliant fence. Fine, I'd build them the most compliant fence they'd ever seen. A maze of compliance so perfect they couldn't possibly object, but so confounding they'd regret ever sending me that notice. I called my lawyer friend David, who specialized in real estate law. "You want to know if you can build a maze on your property that technically complies with HOA regulations?" "Exactly," I confirmed. 3 days later, David called back. "There's no prohibition against what you're proposing, as long as the sections within their jurisdiction use approved materials and dimensions. Their definition of fence is surprisingly vague. It only specifies a vertical barrier structure used to enclose an area." I immediately began drawing up plans. I'd create a maze that was technically a fence, using their approved materials in the small section that fell within their boundary, but designed so any HOA inspector would have to navigate a labyrinth to complete their inspection. Word spread quickly. 7 neighbors pledged money or materials. 3 offered to help with construction. Even Tim offered to provide official stamps for all the plans at no charge. I submitted a formal fence application to the HOA, complete with detailed plans for the section within their jurisdiction. The plans were perfect, exact compliance with every specification. I didn't mention that this section was just a small part of a much larger design. 2 days before the deadline, a certified letter arrived. My application had been approved, with a personal note from Richard. "Mr. Sullivan has expressed particular interest in this project and will be conducting the final inspection personally." Perfect. Sullivan would be the first to experience my compliance maze. The construction took 3 weeks of dawn to dusk work. My neighbors and I built a masterpiece of malicious compliance, a labyrinth of perfectly HOA-approved fencing in the small section that crossed their boundary, connected to an elaborate maze of wooden pathways, dead ends, and switchbacks throughout the rest of my property. From the road, it looked like I was simply building a fancy fence, but anyone who entered would find themselves in a carefully designed maze with over half a mile of twisting pathways. At strategic dead ends, I posted laminated copies of the HOA bylaws, highlighted and annotated to show exactly how my structure complied with their rules. The day after we finished, I sent official notification to the HOA that the fence was complete and ready for inspection. I included detailed maps showing the section that fell within their jurisdiction, with a helpful note that, for safety and liability reasons, inspectors must stay on the designated pathways at all times. The following Saturday, right on schedule, Sullivan's Range Rover pulled up my driveway. He and Richard stepped out, looking smug in their pressed khakis and polo shirts. A third man with a camera followed behind them. "Mr. Collins," Richard began formally, "we're here to inspect the fence replacement as per your approved application." I smiled politely. "Of course. As you know, only a small portion of my fence falls within your jurisdiction. I've marked the entrance to that section for your convenience." I led them to the beginning of the maze, where a professional-looking sign read, "Ridgeview Estates, HOA Boundary, Authorized Personnel Only." "You'll need to follow the path to reach the section that falls within your jurisdiction," I explained innocently. "For safety reasons, please stay on the marked trail." Sullivan frowned. "What is this? We just need to inspect the fence." "And you're welcome to," I replied. "The compliance section is about 400 feet along this path. It's clearly marked." Richard looked uncertain. "This seems unnecessary." "I'm just following your guidelines about property access and safety," I said. "The path is the only way to reach the section you have authority to inspect." Sullivan glared at me, then pushed past. "Let's get this over with." I watched as they entered the maze. The first part was simple enough, just a few turns to give them a false sense of security. Then came the switchbacks, the identical-looking junctions, the paths that seemed to lead toward the boundary, but actually circled back on themselves. From my workshop, I had a perfect view of the maze. I could see Sullivan and Richard getting increasingly frustrated as they hit dead end after dead end. At each one, they'd find another laminated HOA bylaw that my fence structure perfectly complied with. After 30 minutes, they were completely lost. I could hear Sullivan cursing as he hit the same dead end for the third time. Richard was on his phone, presumably looking at maps, but the high fence walls blocked his GPS signal. At the 1-hour mark, I decided to be helpful. I used the PA system I'd installed throughout the maze. "Attention HOA inspectors. If you've reached inspection point C, please proceed to the right and then take the second left to continue to the boundary section." Of course, there was no inspection point C, and those directions led to a particularly confusing section with 4 identical-looking pathways. Around the 2-hour mark, I heard Sullivan shouting my name. He'd climbed onto a bench in one of the dead ends and was trying to see over the walls. "Collins, this is ridiculous. Get us out of here now." I calmly approached within speaking distance, but stayed out of sight. "Mr. Sullivan, are you abandoning the inspection? I can guide you to the exit if you're forfeiting your right to inspect the boundary section." "We are not forfeiting anything," he fumed. "This is harassment." "Not at all," I replied innocently. "I'm simply providing access to the section you have authority to inspect, as required by your bylaws. Would you like me to read the relevant section about inspection access?" Sullivan's face turned an alarming shade of purple. Richard, looking defeated, finally spoke up. Just show us the way out, Collins." "Of course," I said, "but I'll need written confirmation that you're declining to inspect the compliance section. Your bylaws are very specific about documentation." After another 15 minutes of negotiation through the maze walls, Richard signed my prepared statement acknowledging they were leaving without completing their inspection. Only then did I guide them out through the shortest path. As they emerged, sweaty and disheveled, Sullivan pointed a trembling finger at me. "This isn't over, Collins. We'll have this monstrosity torn down." I smiled. "On what grounds? Every inch of fencing within your jurisdiction meets your exact specifications. I have the approved permits right here." Richard tugged at Sullivan's arm. "Let's go, Victor. We need to consult with legal." As they drove away, my neighbors emerged from their hiding spots around the property, applauding and laughing. Frank slapped me on the back. That was the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. The next day, my phone rang nonstop. Local news had somehow gotten wind of the HOA maze and wanted interviews. Neighbors I'd never even met drove by to see it for themselves. Someone even started a GoFundMe to help with any legal expenses, which raised over $5,000 in the first day. The HOA's response was swift. I received a certified letter claiming my structure violated the spirit and intent of their regulations and demanding immediate removal. My lawyer responded with a detailed brief showing how every element complied with their written rules, along with a counter-demand that they cease harassment. 3 weeks later, the HOA held an emergency board meeting. I wasn't invited, but Frank's daughter worked in their office and gave us the highlights. Sullivan had demanded they change the bylaws specifically to prohibit maze-like structures. Several board members pushed back, concerned about the negative publicity and potential legal challenges. The decisive moment came when elderly Mrs. Peterson, who'd been on the board for 20 years, apparently said, "Victor, we look foolish enough already. Your view is not worth this circus." A week later, I received another certified letter. This one acknowledged that my fence technically meets current guidelines and that no further inspections would be required. It also included notice of a public hearing to discuss amendments to fence guidelines for future applications. I considered it a victory, but I wasn't done yet. The next day, I added a final touch to my maze, a viewing platform accessible from my property that offered a perfect view of the Sullivans' house. I installed a bench and a sign reading "Public Viewpoint, Neighbors Welcome." Within a month, the HOA had a new president. Richard Harmon resigned, citing personal reasons. Sullivan put his house on the market shortly after. Apparently, the constant stream of neighbors using my viewing platform to wave at his deck had ruined his enjoyment of his view. As for my maze, it became something of a local attraction. I refined it, added more features, and opened it to the public on weekends for charity events. The irony wasn't lost on anyone when the Ridgeview Estates HOA approached me about using it for their annual community picnic. I agreed, with one condition: they had to update their bylaws to include a grandfather clause for pre-existing structures. They unanimously approved the change the following week. Sometimes I sit on my porch in the evening, looking at my elaborate fence maze, and think about how differently things might have turned out if they'd just left my old cedar fence alone. As my father used to say, good fences make good neighbors, but great fences make memorable lessons. The maze stands as a monument to what happens when you push the wrong person too far. I may be just one stubborn homeowner, but I know my rights. I know how to read fine print, and most importantly, I know how to build things that last.